guess, yeah, John mentioned free will and determinism. That's something that we can certainly discuss. I also wanted to ask you a bit about your theological views, and maybe we could start there. I think there's debate, at least in the YouTube community, as to whether theology is even relevant in a modern or postmodern context. Do you want to say a little bit about why you think it is, or how
Sure.
you think it might be?
Sure, I think the perspective that a lot of people take that would exclude God is based on a worldview that doesn't account for reality in the most complete sense. And essentially, my argument for God begins with a reflection on the phenomenon of awareness, and that awareness itself is very difficult to understand in a deterministic worldview or a reductionistic worldview. And from that, then you get into free will and imagination and creativity, and ultimately it roots you to the idea of a omnipotent being.
Okay. So you begin with, awareness, you say. Is that synonymous with experience, with consciousness, or do you mean something specific by awareness that these other terms wouldn't really...
I don't call it consciousness because the word carries a lot of extra baggage with it. I for a long time was part of online groups that were New Age in timbre, and that word was thrown around with a lot of different meanings, and so I just didn't choose to use it. I think appropriately, maybe you could use it as, say that it's the same thing as consciousness. But essentially, it's the observer that observes the different reactions in our neurology and in our physiology, and is there to apply meaning to the different emotional states that are caused by the brain and the brain chemistry and those sorts of things.
Right.
So it's the observer.
Okay.
Do you mean the subject, as in the viewer of the object in that sense, or you...
Right. The subject, the self, the observer,
Okay.
That's the idea.
All right. So then, theology is relevant because we cannot understand awareness or subjectivity in an empirical or physical or even physiological way. Is that
right? In a physical way, we can understand the brain, but we can't understand our awareness of the brain's functions. If you think of neurology in the way that people would like you to believe in academia, you see a very complicated system of actions and reactions. And for any of those processes to take place, you never have to be actually aware of that. The same thing is done with computers and supercomputers, and I believe there will be a point in which the complexity of the supercomputer will surpass the complexity of the human brain. Several hundred years perhaps in the future, but it's conceivable. Even at that complexity, would that supercomputer not have awareness?
Yeah.
And so the favorite argument, I think, of reductionists is the Occam's razor, and the idea that you're entertaining this whole different set of parameters when you jump into something non-physical. And I think it's justified in that awareness can't be explained with just physical phenomenon.
Right.
It would seem to me to be qualitatively different, and in that the Occam's razor argument does not apply.
Well, Jonathan, there's a lot of metaphors out for this subjectivity and the objective stance, the completely objective stance, empirical stance on subjectivity and awareness. And the metaphors are like a knife can't cut itself, fire can't burn itself. So subjectivity can never actually objectify itself, or objectivity can't, either way you want to look at it. But
Yeah.
do you think these metaphors have a lot of truth intertwined with them? I mean, do you think they're good?
Absolutely. I think if you were to conceive of the self as a single, it's like what do they call it? A single nerve ending. Mm-hmm. The nerve ending can't really feel its own structure. If the self was a single taste bud, it can't quaff its own flavor. If it was an eardrum, it can't hear its own vibration. It was always this sort of input of other information. And in that, we will always have that blind spot when considering ourselves. When we contemplate our navel, we have to do so in a limited way. Absolutely.
Okay.
And would you almost say that to search for or to take an empirical point of view, or to take the point of view of an empiricist or scientist, you almost need to already have assumed the presence of subjectivity in order to come to know anything about the empirical or objective world. Right?
Well, sure. Well, or for empiricism to have any meaning. I mean, empiricism just tells you about the thing you're testing on. If you want to say that, say you're testing the tensile strength of a pencil, the empiricism from that is the tensile strength of that pencil.
Right.
But science isn't so much interested in that as to predict the tensile strength of similar pencils. That's a philosophical leap. And so you're right. Scientists do have to come to terms with philosophy before they engage in meaningful scientific practice.
Right. Okay. So then, getting back to the original question about theology and why it's still relevant, you said basically it's the only way to account for awareness. So how does it, or how would you account for awareness in a theological context?
Well, awareness can take into account things that we can explain deterministically and things that are not so readily understood deterministically. And what seems to be real important to me is the fact that human beings can conceive of things that don't actually exist. However, our ability to make those things manifest is irrevocably limited. Our will seems to be free in the ability to conceive of absolutely anything, but to actually make it manifest, we can't do that. And that's where you get the separation of epistemology and ontology. Whenever we make a theory manifest, we don't, in the sense that, like when we talk about zebras, that zebras come out of our mouths, but rather we talk about ideas, or when we change the world to represent those ideas, rather than manifest reality precisely.
Okay. Right, as far as the free will determinism thing, it's been a really sensitive subject amongst the underground, I like to call it YouTube, philosophical community. And there are a lot of theists and a few theists, or atheists and a few theists. But there's a lot of, the atheists seem to have the big chunk of the pie right now, and it seems to correlate with a deterministic, reductionistic view. I'm generalizing here, so there are a few outliers, but would you say that's accurate? And if so, how do you address this this new tempting atheistic and reductionistic worldview? How do you address that, especially on YouTube these days?
You address it with, I think, with a reasonable amount of expectation for, whenever you're trying to like how to persuade these people, or how to rectify it, or how to explain it.
For the example, Stickam, there is an argument, and it seems if you give valid points, people are reasonable, be it theist, atheist, or spiritual, or they seem to be, if you have a good logic behind what you're saying and reasons, they seem to support that kind of thing. Now, there's going to be interpretations of the data that you give, but I think I like to give people the benefit of the doubt, and if you are a reasonable person and give a good argument, then people are persuaded. And that is the cornerstone of open-mindedness, isn't it?
Right, but it does seem as though logic isn't ultimately the deciding factor in someone's worldview. Certainly theists aren't believers because of a logical argument. I don't even think atheists are non-believers because of a logical argument. I think really there's something moral at stake here that goes beyond logical reasoning.